So we'll now begin our second panel on public performance licensing alternatives. The panel will be moderated by my colleague, Yvette Tarlov, who is Assistant Chief of the Media, Entertainment, and Professional Services section at the Antitrust Division. Yvette?
Thanks, Karina. Good afternoon, everyone. As Karina mentioned, this panel will address public performance licensing alternatives, including direct, adjustable fee blanket, per program and per segment licenses, and whether there is a genuine choice between these alternatives and blanket licenses today. We will also discuss source and through to the audience licenses. Finally, we will address the transparency of the ASCAP and BMI repertories and whether that transparency is sufficient today to support alternatives to blanket licenses. We have an extremely knowledgeable and distinguished panel of speakers. Their list of accomplishments is long, so I will be brief. First, we have Mike Steinberg, Executive Vice President of Creative and Licensing at BMI. Mike leads all of BMI's licensing efforts and is responsible for all domestic licensing, including digital media, radio, television, cable TV, satellite, and other categories, including restaurants and hotels. Next is David Kokakis. David currently is the Chief Counsel of Universal Music Publishing Group, where he oversees Universal's global digital initiatives, business development, contract negotiations, and litigation. Prior to Universal, David was a partner in a media company, practiced entertainment law, and also operated and owned several bars and restaurants in New York City. Our third panelist is Janet McHugh. Janet has served as the Executive Director of the Television Music License Committee, or TVMLC, for the past 4 years. TVMLC represents approximately 1,200 small and large local television stations throughout the United States in connection with music performance licensing. Prior to TVMLC, Janet was an attorney with the Sinclair Broadcast Group, where she also handled negotiation of music licensing. Next, we have Ted Cohen. Ted has had a long and storied career in the entertainment business. He currently serves as managing partner of Strategic, a digital entertainment consultancy based in Los Angeles. He also serves as the head of corporate development for Media Tech Ventures, an Austin-based venture development group. Ted previously was with EMI Music, where he was instrumental in crafting licensing agreements upon which the Apple iTunes Store and Rhapsody Music subscription services were built. And finally, we have Jackie Brenneman. Jackie serves as General Counsel and Director of Industry Relations for the National Association of Theater Owners, or NATO. NATO is a trade association that represents movie theater owners in all 50 states and 100 countries around the world. Jackie leads NATO's legal strategy on a range of issues, including intellectual property and antitrust. So we heard Mike O'Neill, BMI, talk about the 4 key provisions, or I think he called them the core 4 of a proposed modified decree. One of those 4 core is non-exclusivity. The current decrees require that public performance licenses be granted on a non-exclusive basis. In other words, licensees should be free to contract directly with songwriters and publishers for public performance licenses. David, are direct licenses viable alternatives to blanket licenses under the current decrees? Why or why not?
First, thank you for the opportunity to participate today, and thank you for the opportunity to put on a suit and tie for the first time in 5 months. The concept of direct licensing is viable in theory, but in practice, there are complications that we have to look at from both the licensor's perspective and the licensee's perspective. From the licensor's perspective, they often require foreign rights, meaning rights that may only be brought in by foreign societies. So we as publishers are only able to grant direct performance licenses for songs written by songwriters who are direct PRO affiliates in the US. So there's a hole in the licenses when we're asked to grant direct performance licenses on a blanket basis. Adjustable fee blanket licenses also frustrate the process because sometimes the methodology for offset and reduction aren't implemented in practice in a way that is fair. So licensees are in a position where they often have to double pay for rights, which is admittedly untenable. And sometimes the societies have done things to frustrate the ability of licensees to take direct performance licenses, such as restricting the level of direct licenses that may be issued by publishers in exchange for giving advances to writers. So from the licensee's perspective, sometimes it's complicated. From the licensor's perspective, meaning the publisher in this instance, it's often difficult because we can't freely compete against the societies when they're hamstrung by the consent decrees, and the licensee community generally knows that they'll be able to get an artificially low rate because of the current dynamic that exists. So it should be viable. We'd like it to be a viable alternative, but changes need to be made in order to ensure that. Now, the consent decrees don't need to be eliminated. They need to be modified and modernized. They don't need to be subject to a sunset either. They just need to be reevaluated from time to time to make sure that they're keeping up with the needs of a changing market. So one of the ways to ensure that direct licensing is viable is to grant the ability for selective withdrawal, which is something that we had years ago when we negotiated this right through the societies. And the bottom of the market didn't fall out. It was something that enabled us to achieve fair market value for the creators who we represent in direct negotiations with various larger tech companies. And the scope of the rights that we're looking at withdrawing are really limited in nature. So it doesn't involve general licensing. It doesn't involve broadcast TV. It doesn't involve cable. It doesn't involve radio. It involves only the larger tech companies that, as has been pointed out by Mr. Israelite, do not need protection from the DOJ. So in order to facilitate direct licensing, there are things that need to be done in order to make it viable.
Thanks, David. Mike, do you have any response to that?
Yes, I'd like to respond, but first I would like to as well thank the department and certainly you, Yvette, for your invitation to be able to be here today. So, of course, BMI supports a publisher's right to make its own deals directly with music users. They've been doing so for decades. I think we all know it's been somewhat successful, although maybe not as successful as one might hope in the digital space. I think David's company in particular, and his company is not alone, but I'll mention them because they're on this panel, has licensed some of the super large companies that we've been talking about today: Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google, Snapchat. So these are most of the important digital companies out there. And I know there was a big announcement recently about TikTok, and there were already existing major publishers agreements with TikTok. And so these direct licenses are happening in the marketplace. They may not be ideal right now. I'm not part of those negotiations, but they're happening. They're happening while there's a consent decree, while there's a rate court. There were direct licenses with Pandora, and and these go back years. We also, David talked about the limitations of the withdrawal, but I will say that direct licensing has been robust for decades. Janet, I know you could talk to the success that television stations have had over the years as well, negotiating with David's company for hundreds of television shows in any given quarter that have direct licenses with his publishing company across numerous different catalogs. And so we're not saying that we don't want publishers to be able to directly license. Of course we want that. But as we talk about the future, as we look ahead and we say, do we want to risk everything? Do we want to risk the robustness of this industry for a short-term fix that might end up being a long-term disaster? And we feel that the best way to do this is not to push people to the brink of lobbying for compulsory licensing. That's not going to help anyone. Mike spoke about it earlier. It will depress prices, and we'll regret it, certainly. So, we'll talk more about direct licensing as we move forward, but I just wanted to respond that way.
Thank you. Janet, did you have something to add?
I do, actually, because this is very impactful for the TV industry. And Mike, you said it correctly. Direct licenses are viable alternatives to the blanket licenses under the decrees in many cases for the TV industry. Basically, the blanket license has limitations. If TV stations purchase or license their music and the performance rights to that music directly from composers, which we do, they would be paying twice for that music, once under the blanket license and once for direct payment to the composer. It's like buying the motorcycle, car, and boat insurance policy when you don't own a boat or a motorcycle, and then having to buy a separate policy for your car. They are viable alternatives. We're working under them, as Mike said, very robustly right now with ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC. So when the PROs, as under the consent decrees, are prohibited from limiting, restricting, or interfering with a composer's or publisher's ability to enter into licensing transactions, as is currently under the decrees, and when those alternative licenses are economically viable, we're going to talk later about genuine choice, and when the stations have control over the music they perform, and that's pretty much in local programming. When all of these conditions are met, local stations can and do enter into direct licenses under competitive conditions for a portion of the music they perform. The per program, for example, license, and we'll talk about that later, eliminates this double payment problem we have for the same music rights. And I can also say, as Mike alluded to, this isn't just a theory. The 500 plus stations that currently take the ASCAP and BMI per program licenses are, as a result of the non-exclusivity and other related provisions of the decrees, able to secure the rights they need to perform all of the music in their locally produced programs in actual competitive market conditions.
Thanks. Ted, did you have something you wanted to add there?
I'm muted for a moment. Actually, I think David wanted to respond first, and then I'll jump in if that's okay.
Sure. David.
Happy to do that. We have to have a real conversation here about what the objective is. Is the objective to suppress rates and put efficiencies over the rights of the creators? If that's the objective, then yes, direct licensing is viable as it currently exists. But I don't think that's what we're talking about. We want to compete in a free market. We want the right to choose how, when, and the terms upon which the content that we represent and the songs that creators create are utilized by only big tech companies who don't need the DOJ's protection. So it may be viable as it currently exists in general licensing, in broadcast TV, cable, film, radio. We're not talking about that when we discuss selective withdrawals. So we have to really hone in on what the subject matter is, because I feel like we're all over the place when we talk about everything around what the direct point of this is. And, it's not a foregone conclusion that there'll be a legislative fix, because there's nothing broken when you talk about empowering songwriters and composers and creators and publishers to engage directly to achieve fair market value in direct negotiations with the largest tech companies in the world. I don't know why that's so terrifying. And the fear mongering about government intervention and the doomsday scenarios, I don't think anybody's buying that anymore. It doesn't ring true. It's a bit of a disingenuous approach to take. Thank you.
Okay, so this so far has been a wonderful experience, and it's great to be here. And I want to thank Mr. Delrahim, Megan, and Yvette, and everybody. When I volunteered to participate in this, I started getting messages from people What's your involvement? What is your agenda? What is your position on this? And for those of you who know me, I've been spent the last 25 years working on the evolution of the digital ecosystem. I'm usually a moderator at most of these kind of sessions at tech conferences and music conferences. I try and build consensus. So I've expressed that I'm a moderate, I'm a centrist in all this. We need to move things forward. We need to move things, if it's about efficiency, that's great, but not at the expense of compensation. So to explain what I'm about and why I'm here and some of my thoughts, I'm about innovation that leads to maximizing compensation for everybody involved. I'd rather negotiate than litigate. I've fought stagnation from all sides of the table. I mean, of everyone that's here, I'm probably the most conflicted. I mean, I worked for the illegal Napster on a Friday in May in 2000, and on Saturday I was working for EMI Music. So I've been on every side of the issue. I can argue passionately everybody's viewpoint, but the reality is we have a lot of creators, songwriters, musicians, composers, performers that need to get properly compensated. And my goal today in this conversation is to make sure that we don't want to have, streamline this at the expense of fair market value. So my agenda is cooperation and acceleration with minimal legislation. So if everybody can have an open discussion, I know we all have a viewpoint and we all have, our constituencies, but at the end of the day, isn't it really great to click on your phone and hear the song that you've wanted to hear from high school without digging through a stack of records in the garage that your mother put in a box? All that availability to have that immediate emotional response is made possible by the deals that David does and the deals that Mike does, everybody that's been involved here. And I think we have to move from a we'll never do this to, of course we can, we just have to figure out the construct. So I'm hoping that out of these 2 days, there is a sense of moving things forward as opposed to, let's have all these discussions and leave things where they are. Thank you.
Yvette, do you mind if I just add one thing? It's Mike.
Sure. Go ahead.
Raise my hand, but I just want to make sure that we all heard what Mike O'Neill said earlier, and that and Beth echoed as well, that we want to compete in a free market, and it's just a matter of timing and how we get there. And so the suggestion that there is some view on BMI's part that we don't want to compete in the free market is ridiculous. And I would say, if the the hubris of someone thinks that you can just move the needle overnight and completely change something, we would submit is an unrealistic way to approach this, having had very, very detailed conversations with the stakeholders. And there are many stakeholders here. It's not just music publishers and PROs.
Yvette, if I could just respond to that for one moment. I totally support what you're saying. I mean, when the whole Napster thing started in 99, 2000, I gave a talk on CNN with a bunch of people, and there was an artist there. And he said, I want everybody to have my music for free. And I happened to call him after the session, and I said, why would you want your music for free? Are you giving up your advance from your record label? No, I love my advance from my record label. I just want my fans to love me. So, I mean, we've always been in this awkward thing of, everyone loves music, and yet it's undervalued. And I think whatever we can do here to, maintain and even increase the value of music to, to the end user is all our benefit.
Thanks. Let's move on to our next question, so we will be able to cover them all. I think you alluded to it earlier, Janet and David as well. Another of the core fours is alternatives to blanket licensing. The current decrees require ASCAP and BMI to provide alternatives to blanket licensing, such as adjustable fee blanket licensing per program and per segment licenses. Mike, are those alternative licenses viable alternatives to blanket licenses today, and why or why not?
So they are, but before we get to them, I just want to make sure everyone understands, simply because this panel is called Licensing Alternatives should not be taken by anyone to mean that the blanket license, where this all started, is somehow less desirable. In fact, if you look at the hundreds of thousands of BMI licensees, the vast majority are very, very happy with the blanket license. It's effective, it's simple, and the price is right. So We acknowledge, though, that that is not the case with everyone, and so over time, there has been an evolution of licensing alternatives, not as many as we would have liked, and we can get to that in a second, but certainly the program license in local television and radio has been a viable option. If you look at the history of the stations that are on the program license since the 90s when it all started, it's been a steady increase up to nearly half the number of local TV stations in the country. You look at the license fees over that same time period, and they've steadily decreased to the benefit of the local TV industry. I think that Jack Zawaska, in his wildest dreams, never imagined it would be as successful as it has been, what he created back in the day. And so I would say the TV, if you look at the numbers, the TV industry should be pretty happy looking over the time period. The AFBL adjustable fee blanket license is something that's newer. It has been less of a success on the BMI licensee side. We don't necessarily know why. We negotiated that with the committee, but it credits stations for precisely what we would have distributed to our affiliates if we were not carving out, so to speak, from the license. And I'm sure Janet will have more to say on that, but we do think they're viable options. They've been going for quite a long time.
Let me ask you this. In its public comments, ASCAP stated that since its decree was amended in 2001, that no users ever sought a per segment license, and that they were advocating eliminating per segment licenses. Two questions. One, has anyone used a BMI per segment license? And two, what is BMI's position on that?
I don't know that our consent decree actually has a reference to per segment. I may be wrong about that, but I think in over time there have been, I know, attempts to discuss programming periods in a way that are not part of the current per program structure. So I think that would be a question better asked of ASCAP. I don't know.
But my question was, what is BMI advocating? Does BMI want to continue with having a per segment license?
I think what we've said is that we would continue with what the existing alternatives are in the current framework for the time period in time being in this transition period.
Janet, you mentioned earlier genuine choice. The decrees also require ASCAP and BMI to provide a genuine choice between licensing alternatives. What does it mean to have a genuine choice, and is that provision operating effectively today?
Okay, it's a little difficult for me to talk about genuine choice without talking about, following up on what Mike said, that the per program license is viable, it's robust, and I think the most important part of the per program license is that it's allowed stations and rights holders to negotiate license fees and terms under competitive market conditions, cumulatively resulting in the payment of millions of dollars in license fees directly to composers and publishers, all outside of the blanket license process. We've had a lot of folks talk about, the folks that are the companies that are out there, the songwriters that don't, do as well as others. And, we represent, for example, 125 religious TV stations. We represent WINK, Wink in Fort Myers, Florida, family companies, WBRZ TV in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So when we, look at, whether a per program license is viable and what it means to the bottom line of these very small companies, it has impact. But also, we shouldn't forget all of those composers who, through the per program license, are paid directly. And, so that, whether it's BMI, ASCAP, or CSAC, direct licensing and the per program option gets money into composers' pockets directly. Now, they may not be composers that you've heard of, but they write songs too. And, it's important that we keep them in mind as well. Now, I didn't mean to go off script here, but I will just say this, I haven't really seen the quote unquote skinny decrees. I haven't seen them. They haven't been shared with me. But, so I don't know what's in them and what's not in them, but I will just say this quickly. Genuine choice is an absolutely critical element of the consent decrees. There are things that are just working very, very well. And let me just tell you what it means. It means that the licensee has an actual choice between the license types offered. So for a per program license, ASCAP could insist, I'm using them as an example, ASCAP could insist on a per program formula that makes the license sort of a technical option, but not an economically viable option. The genuine choice provision says if you're going to offer alternatives, offer ones that actually reduce the station's payments under the blanket license fees because they're already paying composers directly. So give folks a genuine choice. And currently, the ASCAP and per program licenses are actually doing that. We have a whole history here. In the past, before an antitrust suit was brought, CSAC was offering a per program option that nobody could take. Why? Because they didn't save any money, no matter how much direct licensing they did, no matter how many composers they paid for performance rights. And so therefore, we had to bring a lawsuit, and we don't relish that. We don't think, going back to what Ted said, we don't really think lawsuits are the answer to a lot of things, but sometimes they are necessary evils. Once CSAC came back with a genuine choice, with a per program license that was viable, now, as Mike alluded to, we have over 500 stations, at least right now, that are taking the ASCAP and BMI per program options. So, we are paying under these license options rights holders directly. And it's critical. It's critical to the stations, particularly those owned by small stations, but it's also families, individuals, but it's also critical to the composers like Frank Gehry or Stephen Arnold, folks that, don't have a big name, but who actually write music for local TV.
Thanks. I know Mike and David, you both mentioned AFBLs or adjustable fee blanket licenses. Mike, I think you both also have alluded to the fact that they're not working as well under the current decrees as they could. Can you address that? Go ahead, Mike, and then David, you could address that.
I think what this goes back to is something specifically that Mike O'Neill was speaking about before, and that's the ability to innovate and to try new things and experiment. And the decree as it's currently written restricts what we're able to do. So, for example, we have a new claims-based license that we have been offering in the digital space, and it's something that I'm willing to bet we would have tried a lot sooner, but for our need to make sure that we weren't going to have to live with something for years and years that didn't work for everyone. And so we were much more careful and measured about how we went about negotiating that. I think one of the other things that has become we'll call it a handcuff around what we're able to do in terms of experimentation is, for example, if we were to agree with a music user that we would provide some sort of discount if they were to ask us, can we just take a BMI license? We don't really want any other license. We're willing to pay you more, but pay you less than we would have paid everyone. Is that something that we could do? No, we can't. And so those types of things that may have been written into the decree at a time when people realized or thought that they were restricting something in terms of value, I think is completely stifling innovation. It's preventing things from being experimented with. It's making BMI, be so cautious as to really kind of only in rare circumstances introduce anything new. And plus, we could find ourselves in a situation which we have, in which we want to create something new, but we've got tens of thousands of businesses licensed under a structure that may not make sense anymore. What do we have to do? We have to license the entirety of the category over again, which is a Herculean task, is extremely costly and inefficient. So we're going to make that change. You mentioned a claims-based license. Can you just explain what you mean by that and why you couldn't, or felt like you couldn't offer that sooner under the decrees? So I'll take the second part first. We could have offered it sooner, but it would be something that if we offered it and it wasn't necessarily workable, we might have to have it out there for years to come, because others would say, I want an MFN versus what you gave effectively to that particular music user.
You're referring to similarly situated?
Right, exactly, because of the similarly situated restriction. The claims-based license, in its simplest explanation, is paying for what you use, looking at the total performances that occur on a particular service, and looking at your share of those performances that you represent, whether as a publisher or as a PRO, and calculating using that ratio to calculate what an appropriate fee should be based on a rate agreed to.
Are there any examples of licenses that you feel you have been blocked from offering, or is it more that you just don't want to offer them because you would have to offer them to an entire class of users?
I think the example I gave of sort of a BMI only license with discounted for volume use. I mean, I don't see anything more pro-competitive than entities competing to have their product used more. That to me suggests certainly a pro-competitive use.
David, Ted, either of you have any follow-ups that you'd like to ask?
Again, it's about evolution. It's about evolving what we're doing, and things that aren't working, we should take a look at adjusting. But having negotiated across the table from David at Universal, I can tell you, it's not as onerous as you might seem. I mean, there seems to be a push-pull in terms of who's controlling everything. Everybody, I think, that's here, at least in this session, on what David Israelite had to say, I think we all have a common goal of getting creators paid reasonably for what they some cases paid more reasonably than they ever have before. So I don't think that there's any evil behind the curtain, no matter which way this discussion goes. But again, eventually we have to have this balance of streamlining the process by maximizing return for the people who literally are, as Michelle said earlier, she's in Valley Village down the street from me here in Los Angeles. She lives and dies over the income that she gets from her songs. And we have to recognize that they're the party here that is the most vulnerable, and we have to protect them.
But Ted, thank you for that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you.
Go ahead.
Ted, thank you for the compliment, but you'll ruin my reputation if people think I'm easygoing. So,
well, I'm impressed that John Oliver's letting you use his current TV studio. And that's why.
So I will address the one question that was posed to me about adjustable fee blankets. I've received repeated complaints from licensees who have wanted to license from Universal Publishing directly, who weren't able to do so because the societies did not clearly define what the methodology for offset and reduction would be. And that led to the licensees potentially overpaying or double paying. The societies had been taking the position that irrespective of what Universal's market share represents, the society should receive more than what that offset would call for, because they've aggregated more competitors, more rights, and there's an additional value or minimum value attributable to that. And that frustrates direct licensing. And what we've had in each of those instances is the licensees say, you know what, we would have taken this license from you directly. Thank you, but we're not going to, because it's been too difficult to deal with the societies in closing the AFBL.
Thank you. Well, let's move on so we can have Jackie can have a chance to answer a question. Content creators generally negotiate with music publishers and songwriters at the time they sync the music to the video. This is known as source licensing. Because content creators could substitute one song for another, the market for sync rights arguably is competitive. Although sync rights are licensed at the source, public performance rights, with the exception of theaters, historically have not been. David, can you elaborate as to why you think that is?
Well, when we're talking about issuing one-off synchronization licenses, we're very clear about the scope of the project, the specific use of the music in incorporation with the audiovisual work, and to some extent, in some instances, where that specific piece of work will travel, meaning the territory for exploitation, the length of time that the audiovisual work will be made available, the other terms that would be disclosed to us at the time of licensing. When you're talking about licensing on a blanket basis for projects that have not yet been conceived of, it becomes very difficult to price. So we typically leave that responsibility in the hands of the societies. And we typically look to the platforms that exploit those works to take those licenses, as opposed to giving that license at source. So that's the way it plays out in practice. It just doesn't seem like a viable option to do those types of deals on a direct basis. Whereas, again, with individual one-offs, it's a bit easier when the scope of exploitation and specific use is a little more clear.
As a result of several court cases, the ASCAP decree was modified in 1950 to require producers to procure the performance rights to downstream theater exhibitors, the so-called movie theater exemption. The BMI decree does not contain this exemption, although BMI has followed it in practice. Jackie, should the current decrees be modified to eliminate or expand the theater exemption?
Thank you, Yvette. And of course, thank you to Megan Delverheim and the whole department for having me here to speak on behalf of movie theater owners. I do want to start by explaining why NATO is here in the first place. It might seem strange that movie theaters are included in a discussion on blanket performance rights licenses. After all, a blanket license serves a very unique problem, right? Businesses want to be able to negotiate to program music flexibly, and artists need compensation for those performances. Individual negotiations in those circumstances would be impossible, as would constant auditing and enforcement. But of course, many movie theaters do take on blanket licenses, as any other business would, for the music played in their bars, lobbies, and other common areas. But the question that you raised, of course, relates specifically to the cases underlying the initial music licensing consent decrees. And those cases stem from the impact of the evolution of technology on music and movies. So while movie theaters do not currently need the flexibility and variety for music in their auditoriums, as David alluded to, that there's those titles are done for a specific scope with a specific intention for exploitation. They absolutely did need those kinds of licenses during the silent film era. So in those days, a live musician would actually accompany the movies with songs they could independently select. Therefore, movie theaters needed blanket licenses to allow for those performances. However, once sound was introduced into movies, theaters no longer had any control over the choice of song, but ASCAP, which was then the largest PRO by far, denied its members the right to license performance rights with film producers at the source. So, as a result, movie theaters were then forced into performance licenses in order to play movies that they already licensed. So, as you might guess, ASCAP took advantage of this uneven power dynamic to increase the price of blanket licenses issued to theaters by upwards of 1,500%. So that anti-competitive practice led to the Alden, Rochelle, and Whitmark lawsuits you were referring to. After the movie theaters were successful in their claims, licensing performance rights for theatrical exhibition in the United States was included in the same transaction with film producers as the negotiation for synchronization rights. Because, of course, that was the purpose of the music. It was for that type of exploitation. And this makes sense. Movie theaters have no control over the song selection and would have no way of assigning appropriate value to an individual author. Producers, on the other hand, are aware of their budgets and can work with artists to determine an appropriate market value. These negotiations allow for flexibility, even profit sharing for established artists. In other words, these negotiations permit innovation and profit sharing agreements. New artists, on the other hand, can offer more affordable rates in exchange for the reputational boost from appearing in a feature film. Negotiating for the song within the context of its intended use and its importance to the film and scene in which it appears ensures that the songwriter is compensated for the true value of the song rather than by subjecting it to a separate process where the value is based simply on the fact that the song is played. Make no mistake though, movie theaters absolutely still pay for the music included in films, but these costs are simply passed on to theater owners through the fees that they pay to license films for theatrical exhibition. So, what is referred to as this movie theater exemption is really not an exemption at all. It's an affirmation of the obvious fact that blanket licenses are not appropriate for music already licensed for movies intended to be shown in movie theaters in the post-silent film era. This is not in any way about preventing innovation. It is about ensuring that a blanket license does not apply where actual negotiations can exist. It makes no logical, economic, or competitive sense to require a blanket license where one is not necessary. The Supreme Court has been clear that blanket licenses are, quote, substantial deviations from the competitive norm. But they're allowed because they solve a unique problem and because of the safeguards of the decrees. The unique problem that they solve simply does not exist for music in movies shown in movie theaters, as those rights are pre-selected by the producer. So in those cases, flexibility and an inability to directly negotiate are not relevant. The core holdings of Alden Rochelle are just as relevant today and should be upheld and applied to all PROs as they are in practice today because the license happens at the source. Movie theaters simply should not require a separate blanket license for music in theatrical movies, period. I do want to add that we are all operating during an unprecedented global pandemic that has devastated businesses and individuals across the globe. Almost no industry has been impacted more than movie theaters, which have had revenues drop by over 97% this year. To undertake a review process for the so-called movie theater exemption, a legal precedent which has been upheld over and over again, is simply inappropriate and untimely at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mike, Jackie has explained the not an exemption. It really is that blanket licenses are not necessary when music is licensed at the source. Why does that same logic not apply to other forms of distribution? Like when a movie that is been in a theater is distributed over cable television or television. Those that pay public performance.
The Alden Rochelle was specifically about movie theaters, and the industry has been operating that way for the last 60 years. I think your original question to Jackie was should this be part of a consent decree? And the answer to that is no. The industry is operating fine and has been operating fine for 60 to 70 years. In fact, in the theater owners' submission to the DOJ, they said the general provision in the BMI consent decree requiring BMI to engage in non-exclusive licensing, which will remain, plus the industry practice that has built up around source licensing of theatrical performance rights, have achieved the same result as the ASCAP consent decree provision. So you don't need to add it to BMI's, and by saying that, you actually don't need it to be in the ASCAP consent decree because it is the Supreme Court law of the land, and everyone's been following it all the way down the chain.
But that was a...
I want to note, I do agree with Mike on that principle broadly. And you're right that there's case law that absolutely enshrines this and protects us. We do just want to express concern that absent that the consent decrees and the explicit protection, we saw what happened. So especially at a time like this, when there is just unprecedented losses, to upend that and to, expose our industry to some sort of vulnerability that is unnecessary, and as you and I both agree, is unprecedented by the laws. The laws do not support that kind of change, would be terrible. So whether or not it's continuing the exact provision, whether it's expanding it, whether it's affirming that the holdings of Aldrin Rochelle apply the same today, that's fine. But what we do not want is to somehow end direct negotiations where they are absolutely appropriate.
Thanks, Jackie. Mike, I just wanted to get back to, the question was whether it should be eliminated or expanded. And my question to you is, what is the logic behind not expanding the theater exemption to a broader class of distributors, including television, cable television, the digital streaming services like Netflix?
We would certainly support that. No surprise.
So are you suggesting that we eliminate the public performance right from all media? Because I don't think that would be such a good idea.
No, my question just is
so have it flow differently. And I think that question has been one I've asked over the years. I think David touched on it a bit in referencing the scope of the license and having to figure that out at the outset. But there are ways around that. You can add to existing licenses to include more territories. And I don't know that it's been attempted, or I've asked that question for years. I don't know why we complain about all the music being in the can and we don't fix what's in the can. Maybe Janet can speak to that.
Well, let's talk about some through to the audience license. The 1950 amendments to the ASCAP decree clarified that the through to the audience provision covered broadcasters in addition to radio. In 2001, that through to the audience license was expanded to cover online users as well as any as yet to be developed technology. The BMI decree doesn't contain those provisions, but BMI has granted through to the audience licenses. So Janet, should the decrees be modified to eliminate or expand through to the audience licenses?
Yeah, we're not really aware of any basis for eliminating the through to the audience provisions. We have some very serious concern about the elimination of those license requirements, and for the following reasons. The big three networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, secure through to the audience licenses for their network programming and thereby cover a portion of local station programming. Local stations do not have to secure a license for that network programming. So for example, King 5 in Seattle, who's an NBC affiliate, does a lot of local programming, does evening magazine show, does a lot of news, or WABC in New York City or WUSA in Washington, D.C., they only require performance licenses for a portion of the broadcast day, that portion that is local. Without the through to audience provisions, ASCAP and BMI might attempt to secure license fees from both the networks and the stations. That's our major concern here. It's sort of, multiple stages of the distribution chain. How many, rungs in that chain are going to have to pay license fees? Also, we have another issue in that local stations, large and small, now provide their local news programming to internet streaming services. And without the through to the audience requirements of the consent decrees, ASCAP and BMI could attempt to secure license fees from every entity in the distribution chain, likely increasing the overall royalties, but there's no real change in the actual use of the music. The music stays the same for the same purpose. It's just that there's, additional, dissemination from the networks to the stations, et cetera. But it's the same programming and the same music.
Mike,
So
what is, oh, sorry, go ahead, Janet.
we would not be, probably don't need to repeat myself. We would not be in favor of eliminating that provision.
Mike, what is BMI's position? Are through the audience licenses contemplated by the Core 4 approach?
So when you look at our consent decree, we do not have the through to the audience language that ASCAP has. We do have language that requires the broadcast network model to succeed as Janet laid out. When I've been in charge of licensing for a long time, and when I look back at requests, I think back to requests that we've had for any kind of through to the audience license, through to the viewer license, despite not having that same language that ASCAP has in their consent decree, we've never said that we're not going to provide that type of license to the extent that there's a transmission and, you know, the chain of transmissions, it makes sense. And I look at the way that's defined and I say that's the way we've operated. So I don't see any reason to have to change that.
So in what is being proposed as a replacement or modified decree, would BMI contemplate having a provision, a through to the audience license provision in that modified decree?
No, we don't see any reason to add it to the decree. In the same way we wouldn't see adding an Alden Michelle exemption provision to the decree to be of any value. This is how we've been operating for years, and there's no reason it would change.
But you've been operating that way because ASCAP has been under those provisions, correct?
We haven't been operating that way because ASCAP is operating that way. We've been operating that way because that's how the marketplace has evolved. And it may be the case that the language is in the ASCAP decree, but it doesn't need to be because this is how everything has been working for decades.
Earlier, I think, or at least there were in all the comments, or a lot of the public comments we received, several people mentioned or raised concerns about the level of transparency in the current ASCAP and BMI databases. Janet, are the current databases sufficient from a user perspective? What is missing today, if anything, both in terms of content and functionality?
Well, thank you for letting me talk about this absolutely critical issue, important for all of us, not just for users, for everybody involved in this process. The more transparency, the better. The lack of a public, universal, complete, real-time, accessible database is a major stumbling block to a more efficient and competitive marketplace. We would fully support modifying the consent decrees to require more robust disclosure. And let's bring everybody into this database. Let's bring every PRO. Let's bring CSAC. Let's bring GMR data. We want all data. We want the best data we can get. We want to know who to pay. And so it's critical. It's hard to understand in this day and age why we don't have that, why we don't have a database that connects sound recordings to musical works and to musical works rights holders along with their PRO affiliations. Composers and publishers change PRO affiliations. We need real-time information. Also, we should have a database that has cue sheets in it. ASCAP and BMI have massive cue sheets, and we would like a cue sheet database. So what else is missing to your specific question? Well, the current ASCAP and BMI database doesn't include all fractional interests. First of all, ASCAP and BMI are independent entities, and our understanding is that because they're independent with independent databases, there's no sort of joint reconciliation of information inconsistencies between their databases. For completeness, any database should contain data from all the PROs, CSAC and GMR. And I'll end very quickly on this to just say there is simply no universal agreement on who controls what. we go into negotiations with PROs, and ASCAP says they have the biggest share, and BMI says they have the biggest share, and CSACs, yes, we're growing. We may be bigger than ASCAP, we may be, and we don't know. But if we had a database with cue sheets in it and totally transparent, accessible in real time, we would know. We'd be able to figure that out. Big data is here, and we're behind. So we're still waiting for that. We would do whatever it took to assist in creating that, and so far hasn't materialized.
Mike, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, I will respond to that. Thank you. So we have been providing data on our website as ASCAP has for years, and before that in book form and CD-ROM form, and that's despite not having necessarily the requirement to do all of that. And as it happens, I think Janet probably knows that BMI and ASCAP are working currently on the reconciliation of the data that she is concerned is not reconciled, and we're working on that. And
is that the SongView database?
Yes, that's the SongView database, and we hope to have that done this year. And it's there's a lot of work that goes into that, as you can imagine, given the vast volume. But I will talk to one other thing that Janet mentioned, and that's cue sheets. And people should understand that BMI doesn't create these cue sheets. Program producers create these cue sheets. In fact, Janet's TV stations, to the extent that they create programs, create cue sheets also. So they create more cue sheets than we do. We do collect them from program producers, but there's a cost that's involved with that. And it's not, the answer isn't simply for BMI to make all of the cue sheets that we have collected over the years and spent money doing available on a database. Janet works with a company that, or her TV stations work with a company, and she does as well, that has access to cue sheets. And as far as I understand, as the provider of cue sheets to TV stations, they charge them for every single one of them. So why should we do it for free?
Ted, I know you and David also both have positions on this issue. Do you want to?
Well, one thing everyone should understand is that publishing rights move much faster than recorded master rights do. I mean, usually if an artist is signed to a label, he's at the label, and the label doesn't change ownership too often. But music compositions, publishing catalogs move at the speed of light, and sometimes. So it's really important that this database, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Janet said in that we need the transparency, we need the immediacy, because there are a lot of people who end up unintentional bad actors. They really aren't bad actors. They just, they literally end up paying the wrong person because the databases aren't up to date. The other thing is, and it was touched on, and Mike sort of touched on it, is who owns the database and what, how is it funded? Because a lot of people have said, I'm going to build the library at Alexandria. We're going to build the global library of rights, and then, but here's what it's going to cost you to access it. So I think it's something that has to be, again, evolve really quickly and be useful, but it can't be with yet another gatekeeper blocking access to it. So transparency and a really fluid way of interacting with it is critical for all this to go forward.
David, do you have something you want to add?
Sure. Well, transparency is achievable if it's a real goal, as opposed to a buzzword that's been used to appear forward-thinking and progressive. So it's really about who's walking the walk, and we don't see very much of that in the marketplace this day. The societies have been talking for years about a centralized repository for data as amongst a few of those societies. I agree with some of the comments made that it should include all rights holders and all rights types. So there's a single point of entry to find out about who owns what and in what shares, and to have visibility into when rights shift, which does happen quite often in the publishing industry. So to address this, at least in part, universal publishing in 2014 made publicly available our entire catalog showing ISWC, songwriter name, partial interests, society affiliation. It's not only searchable on a song-by-song basis, but also could be extracted as a full data dump into an Excel spreadsheet or other format to help get people past being precious about ownership information. Those days really need to be behind us, and I think we need to work toward this common goal, which would benefit licensors and licensees alike. The closest thing you see to that now is happening with the MLC, the mechanical licensing body that was born of the MMA, and hopefully those efforts will go well. We're working hard to make that happen, but it's a limited fix. It needs to be done on a much broader scale. And for those of us who recall, there was a global repertoire database initiative over 10 years ago out of Europe, which was derailed by the societies. I know that's a controversial comment, but I think anyone who's involved in that process knows that to be accurate. Now, the cost is a big concern. Who's going to pay for it? I think, given that it really does serve the greater good, it's the type of thing that everybody, licensors and licensees alike, can contribute to. So it's idealistic to some extent, but achievable, as I said, as long as we treat transparency as a real goal as opposed to just something that looks good in a headline. Thank you.
Yvette, can I just add one quick comment? I know we're talking about databases. I just want to make sure everyone understands that what BMI and ASCAP are working on is not necessarily a database per se in the way that others may have been spoken, but more of a reconciliation engine that will provide data back to, two separate places, but reconciled data that will be accurate. So, and there's one other thing that I wanted to mention. I think as we talk about data and we talk about all getting smarter about who owns what's, portions of what songs, because as Ted mentioned, things do change. The data exchange currently going on in the context of claims-based licensing, whether it's data dumps or otherwise, reconciling data that's correct or incorrect, is going to make everyone a lot smarter going forward as to who owns what. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be a lot better.
So you mentioned earlier the database that you're working on, the SongView database, is going to indicate what fraction of each of the songs is held by who. Is that correct? Can you just maybe describe a little bit more about what SongView is and when it is coming?
I believe it will be by the end of this year, and I'm certainly not the expert on this. You might have more panelists in the coming 24 hours who could speak to this better, but I do understand it as letting a searcher know who other participants necessarily as it relates to BMI and ASCAP, but perhaps not the exact share. I don't know precisely how the interface looks because it's still in the works.
Anyone else have any further comments they'd like to share?
I'll just say this, if I may. One of the benefits of greater transparency and having data like this readily available is that it'll be easier to facilitate direct licensing, which is, as you know, an objective of the publishers. And I think it serves the greater good in having this information out there so you know who owns what, and it makes it a streamlined process to obtain licenses as opposed to keeping publishers and creators in this all-in or all-out construct that was mandated by the rate courts.
Thank you. I see Karina has appeared on our screen, which means we're nearing the end of our time. This has been a very informative debate, and I want to thank all of our panelists for their considerable contributions. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thanks to Yvette and her panelists for a fantastic discussion.